Good example. You see a nice car in the street before people are a drug dealer. Nowadays, what's the trend? Money laundering. So you see that people are becoming aware of the crime.
Okay.
And people do know what it possibly might constitute.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of the SiGMA podcast. Today we're going to be meeting Philip Bugeja. Philip's an expert on the subject of AML, although I'm not sure if he would like me to use the word expert in this case, but from the little we spoke before, he's also going to continue his studies to further your knowledge.
Further improve.
Why? If you don't mind me asking. And first of all, thank you for accepting our
You're
invite.
more than welcome. The field is always evolving, and there is no point where you can say, I know what I know, and it ends there. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're dealing with criminal activity is always changing. New methods of fraud are constantly coming up. When it comes to money laundering, new methodologies come up, new products come up as well that might facilitate for a period of time until they're regularized. So it's an ever-changing. Obviously, you have new technology these days. Crime changes quite a lot. I think the typical, you can see it even in history, bank robberies. How many bank robberies do we hear about these days? It's become more of a
strangely enough, you
technology.
still hear quite a lot of them in America, but in the rest of the world, it's a rarity.
Exactly. I think dealing with bank robbers, I think it's an old profession nowadays. And I don't think you're really going to get away with much until you know exactly what there is and what there isn't.
So it's a romantic notion.
Exactly.
Okay. Your first answer, and you've given me so much to start asking you about. First off, do you have a background in law enforcement or?
So, in law enforcement, no, obviously, but we've done a lot of research on. I've worked temporarily with one of the Maltese authorities. Mm-hmm. We do consult a number of authorities, though, and assist, but directly on law enforcement now, basically. Mostly served as an MLRO with international agencies as well. Mm-hmm. So that's basically.
So how did you actually get into this field, the field of AML?
Okay, so I think it's a very, very long story. It was one of the fields that always interested me.
Okay.
I think it's very, very complex field, and it's ever evolving, and it's always a challenge. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say. I can't say I was immediately drawn, but then once you start to analyze and look into the field a little bit more, it's something that is extremely interesting. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of understanding. It takes understanding even both sides, not only the law enforcement side. You need to also understand how the criminal mind works as well. Mm-hmm. You need to identify yourself methods which could possibly lead to, let's put it that way. So I think it's something which you need to be very, very, very much on the ball, especially in the industry. Things are constantly changing.
That's the third time you're talking about evolving and changing.
Okay.
And you spoke about new products, new methods, new tech, and how crime changes. Okay, it's it's 2 words. 3 words. How can you explain that? But it's a lot more complicated than that. So let's break it down. New products. When you say new products, do you mean new products to detect money launderers, or new products for money launderers
Both
to
ways.
use?
Both ways.
In what sense?
Let's take it this way. Money is a very sensitive topic. Okay. So money is something which is very close to people. Mm-hmm. And touching it can lead to a lot of bad consequences. We've had very serious crimes in the past for ridiculous amounts of money. So let's take a step back and say...
When you say...
Okay.
Let's break
it down a little bit more.
Because you say, we've had ridiculous crimes, we've had serious crimes for ridiculous amounts of money. But you don't give me an example.
Okay, we've had, for example, murders happen because of disputes related to money.
Such as?
We've had locally, we can obviously find them
locally.
locally.
Locally, I understand. Locally, I think what springs to mind immediately from my days at the MGA was the robbery at Casino di Venezia, which amount we actually never established.
Okay.
You're familiar with that
I'm
case?
I'm familiar with the case.
I actually was in post-licensing and enforcement department.
Okay.
I still remember the phone call I got in the middle of the night from, at the time, Joe F. Borg, who now works at WH. And from here, I'd like to say hello to him, and hopefully we'll see him soon back podcasting. But I still remember that particular incident. You had the HSBC heist in Balzan, which was literally down the road from where I live.
When we're discussing crimes in relation to money, we're not saying like a bank robbery or a theft or anything else. We're saying, let's take it this way. If you had a large sum of money, I came and took it from you. Would you like that?
Definitely not, and there's going to be serious repercussions.
There you go. So take it from the way from a money laundering perspective, where you've amassed a large sum of money, you want to use it, you set plans for it, and then you can't use it because of someone.
Because of journalists doing their job, for example.
Apart from journalism, let's talk about money laundering detection. Let's say the person gets caught. Let's say it's detected. So there is a lot of things why a person might lose. So it's a very sensitive topic, and that's why further crimes can happen.
Okay. So we've spoken about the amounts.
Okay.
So when you talk about products,
Okay.
how, I mean, you've got the placement, the layering, and we all know what that is. And we've had Manfred Galdes on this show already, and has explained this. But when it comes to the how, so into what do you layer? Is it bank accounts, or are there these new products? What are these new
We wouldn't be
products?
giving tips on how to launder money. There are a number of ways it can be done, and obviously we've seen especially certain trends come up which are temporary and just vanish in thin air.
Okay.
My opinion, the NFT market was one of them. Like although it's a legitimate market, I understand
market
that
being for the benefit of
basically the non-fungible tokens, trading of certain assets online. I think it was a temporary boost. It's still a strong industry. It's still something which is still going, but I think it could have been potentially used, just like anything else. Any product you have, if it's placed on the market, the first thing that's going to be done is to be tested for its basically
for its
vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are made. In fact, main cases we see in startups, once a startup launches, first few months are very, very critical because people are actually testing the controls of the system, what they can do, whether they can do things. So we end up seeing a lot of, let's say, attempts happening at the startup phase. Which you tested very heavily on.
Okay. So, products, methods, tech, and crime changes. Tech,
it depends. Tech can be twofold. So you've got tech which prevents money laundering and tech which can facilitate money laundering. So it's I wouldn't say it's a knife that cuts on both ends. Let's say from a prevention perspective, tech can help a lot. Okay, but tech obviously depends on what. Let's take these new technologies of AI. Unfortunately, if you're going to feed garbage in, garbage out, so tech is also dependent.
So it all depends on what you're giving.
On what you're giving it in, how you're training it, how you're feeding it, what information you're feeding into it. I still believe there needs to be a very, very heavy input from a human element perspective. People need to understand more. People need to understand the case. There needs to be certain triggers within the person that helps understand certain cases. So if I had to see something, what emotional response will that trigger?
Excuse me.
Okay.
Say that again.
An emotion response which triggers. So if I had to tell you, for example, John Dillinger, let's go with one name, that's automatically going to trigger.
John Dillinger.
The bank robber, exactly. So that's automatically going to trigger something. Like, all right, this is bad. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So that's an emotional response which should trigger to certain crimes, even certain methods of crime. Even when training individuals, you need to gauge that response from that individual, that when they're looking at something, there is an understanding that something might possibly be wrong. I'm not saying to go on the offense and find something in everyone, because effectively you will. And you always need to see things from an innocence perspective. When there's something, though, that does create that reaction, that's very, very important.
When I read some books on the history of money laundering and investigation, they actually start attributing most of the groundwork which was laid to Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York.
I think it goes further than that.
But he is the one who seems to have codified the matter using, at the time, what was known as RICO.
Exactly.
And then his model seems to have been adopted, was partly copied by one of his friends, who on this island is quite at least known, because in the law course we actually studied him, Giovanni Falcone.
Okay.
And they had coined the phrase "follow the money."
Okay.
Is that still applicable today?
We've got cases, I've done research on the beginning, which even goes back to China, dealing in opium in the 1800s. So money laundering has always been
No,
prevalent.
money laundering has always been, but I'm talking about enforcement.
Enforcement, I think, it was always the case, especially when you're dealing with organized crime. It was always, I think it's become a little bit more known these days.
Okay.
And the terminologies have been more obviously spread, there's more awareness, there's more understanding about the crime as well. Now, when we're saying, sorry, I forgot your question. I've heard it so much.
Follow the money. Is it
Follow
still
the
relevant to this very day?
It is, but the problem has become there is so many things and so many inhibitors these days that following the money isn't always the case.
Inhibitors, in what sense?
Inhibitors, for example, if I had to tell you I can't open a bank account, I'm legitimate, I could be a legitimate person, you just can't open a bank account.
Why?
Unfortunately, we're seeing certain trends these days which follow a pattern of money laundering when in fact they're not, because of inhibitors within the market. So, for example, a person not having access to proper banking facilities, certain companies not having access to, for example, payment providers. Then you've got certain charges from certain banks where people decided to obviously diminish the charge, move the money around to avoid or try to reduce the level of the charge. So these are all things which effectively can seem to be bad, but effectively there's nothing wrong with them.
You mentioned the criminal mind. In your experience, have you seen in Malta an evolution on the enforcement side which tells you, okay, things are improving?
Things are moving. We're seeing more prosecution. There's more prosecution on money laundering. There's more awareness on money laundering. There's more awareness on the predicate offences that constitute money laundering.
Predicate offences. We need to break it down to simplify for our audience.
Basically, predicate offences are those offences which can ultimately constitute to a charge of money laundering against you as well. So if you're charged with fraud, eventually you're charged with money laundering as well. So these are forms of predicate offences. If we look at the 6th directive, there's a whole list which can lead to predicate offences as well.
Okay, that's something I want to touch on later on.
Okay.
Legislative developments at an EU level.
Definitely.
So you are seeing a growing trend of enforcement in Malta.
There is.
Which, would you say that grey listing pushed this further?
I think it's more awareness on the terminology of money laundering.
Okay.
When a crime becomes more known, automatically people are going to look at it a lot more.
Okay.
I'm not going to say it's going to become fantasized, but it's something which I think even if we had to look back, let's get a stupid example. Very
ahead.
stupid
There's
example.
nothing stupid over here.
You see a nice car in the street. Before people were a drug dealer. Nowadays, what's the trend? Money laundering. So you see that people are becoming aware of the crime.
Okay.
And people do know what it possibly might constitute. I don't know if they're fully aware of what it is.
In weird circles.
Yes. So it is that people are getting more aware, and I think even businesses are more aware of it, even people who are not in this industry are aware of it.
But okay, you're talking about businesses, and when I speak to some people in the business sector, they actually say, there's a saying in Maltese,
Okay.
it's either raw or overcooked.
Okay.
I'm breaking it. It doesn't make so
Breaking
much
it down,
sense
alright.
when it's said in English. Ma neja jew misjura works perfectly in our language. And now they're obviously saying, in the beginning it was raw. Now
It's become a little too
it's
much.
become a little bit
Right.
too much.
That's you're talking from an enforcement perspective
Yeah.
and from penalty perspective.
Yes.
It's a very good question and a very, very deep question. I think there have been certain elements which have been a little bit overdone. I wouldn't like to delve too much into this matter, but I think there are things that can be improved. A lot. They have to.
And what about the fact that penalties being imposed by the FIU at the end of the day are actually being shot down by the courts? What does that tell you?
There is a need of enforcement, and there was a need of enforcement. I think it's a very, very important topic that companies need. It also creates a level playing field. I can't have person A meeting all regulatory requirements, person B is not meeting regulatory requirements, and nothing's
And they're
happening.
supposed to be competing.
Let's understand this as well. You follow regulatory requirements, you're going to suffer a loss for sure. If it's done incorrectly, you're going to suffer a massive loss. Especially if you're not getting the equation right and making the whole procedural flow in a way, and I like to say it's a lot commercially viable for the business. That is, that you really need to be on the ball, assess what's happening, do a little bit more from an MLRO perspective. If you're doing nothing, it's easy.
Yes. If you're following the word of the law.
Exactly. It's easy. What's going to happen to competition then? Is there going to be fair competition? So I'm employing my compliance staff, I'm stopping customers, I'm reporting, I'm checking, I'm doing my internal audits, and someone else who isn't. It doesn't make sense. There has to be a level play.
Fair.
It's not fair at all. And this delves also into the issue of regulatory arbitrage between one jurisdiction to the other.
Okay.
So
what do you mean there by regulatory arbitrage?
Regulatory arbitrage, when you get jurisdictions which have weaker AML procedures and you basically divert your portfolio into different regulations.
So you would shift most of your operations from
It's very
one
hard.
licensed jurisdiction to another license.
It's very hard to say shift because there's a lot in moving someone from one license to another.
Yes and no.
So yeah, in a way. Okay, so if
It
I have
depends
someone,
where that player is from.
exactly, and let's take it on a logical way. So if you have someone under one license, and then you can't just simply say, "Listen, hey, you didn't provide due diligence, I'm gonna move you to this one because it's weaker." It's not really. It happens. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it's not really
At least you're being a realist.
looping around. Then again, it shouldn't even be the case because you've got jurisdictions which made their efforts into coming up with a good regulatory framework and is actually working to prevent something. There needs to be, even now we're seeing it with the MLR, and sort of a certain level of harmonization as well.
Okay, so you've used the H word, harmonization. I wanted to jump into the topic also
Okay.
because now we're getting towards the end. H word, harmonization.
Okay.
It's usually a European Union coined term. What is the EU doing? Where do we stand right now at an EU level?
Right now, there have been a number of discussions. There's been a huge promotion in public-private partnerships as well, which is very, very good. Where authorities are reaching out to the private industry, understanding more the private industry, getting to know more basically from both sides of the playing field, which is very, very important. You need to listen, you need to do immense research, you need to speak to a number of operators. Operators need to give the feedback to the authority if they want things to change. If you want things to work well, it has to be a twofold approach, always. We've seen the introduction of obviously certain new regulations, the formulation of the new AMLA, we've got the new AMLR, we've got the 6th directive coming out.
You have the new,
The AMLR.
the AMLRO.
No, AMLRs only.
Okay.
Those are the Anti-Money Laundering regulations.
Okay.
Okay.
And those will be under the 6th.
Those will fall in a category. Basically, the way I'm saying it, obviously each jurisdiction needs to transpose their own.
Okay.
So I'm not going to comment much on it. The guidelines are there. One can go in and read them and understand.
How when would they come into full force? So when would Malta need to transpose them? Malta needs to transpose them.
Needs
right?
to transpose them.
When would Malta need to do
I'm
that?
sure that they're undergoing at this time.
So they're undergoing at this
undergoing.
time. Okay.
I'm not going to comment because I'm not involved, but I'm sure there's some planning going on for sure.
Okay. We're coming towards the end
Okay.
of the podcast. Consultation, communication. How important are those two terms vis-a-vis the local regulated environment and the stakeholders? So the MGAs, the regulator, the FIU, the MFSA, the government, and actually the private sector. You mentioned the public-private partnerships, which would be more on the commercial. But on administrative, legislative level, how important is the communication to happen between all of the stakeholders,
Let's
including
take this way.
public and private?
Let's take it this way. If you have a position, you're going to know about your position. Okay? You're going to know about your competition as well. If you're in a business, you're going to know about your business. You're going to know about competition within your line of business. Okay? So, unfortunately, it's easy for people to narrow down their sights. So, getting more insight on certain things is very important. In fact, that's why focus groups exist, that's why consultations exist, that's why communities exist, like discussions, forum, conferences, that's why they're there. It is important always to understand not only your line of work, but also other people's line of work. And other people's line of work, considering not just the AML part of it, the commercial side, payment side. There are a number of, it's multi-layered basically. So unless you delve into and understand business as a whole, and as I always say, no two businesses are alike. The pattern is there, but they're never alike. Until you get as much understanding of businesses and how they operate and how they work and what's the loopholes, what's the struggles they're facing. Once you build that understanding and you have a clear oversight, then it's much easier to work together. Because you know that this company cannot do that, that market you cannot do, this business cannot do this. Until you find an approach that it will never be fit for all, and you can't say there's a one-size-fits-all. Or at least there's a level of interpretation which can be done that, with the right people involved, can be interpreted in a way that makes your business succeed.
Okay.
And having more insight is very, very important in any business you do. Insight is very important. Knowledge, yes. Knowledge is part of it, but understanding what's happening around you is even more important. Understanding what competition, understanding regulators, understanding different parts of the business. Maybe we see it a number of times from an APR perspective. You come up with a policy, then someone else comes in and says this won't work. Because when I'm doing this with this provider or with this, we need to have these things in place. So you need to loop everyone in. You need to understand every aspect of the business.
Okay.
You need to understand even certain inhibitors you might have from effectively getting the end result, basically.
Philip, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciated the time we had together. Remind you that we have another edition of the SiGMA podcast coming with you most probably next week. Also, SiGMA will be hosting its next event in Budapest later on this year. And if you want more information, just access the SiGMA website. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.